When did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
And welcome back to House of Asher, all my freaks and freakettes and various mutants and horror shows out there. This is episode 77, and we're going to get a little weird. We're going to get a little witchy this episode. And some of the stuff we're going to be talking about, some of you guys may know a little bit about it, but there's probably some things you're going to hear that's new. And definitely it's going to be from a different vantage point. I'm going to be talking about the late Mr. Charles Manson, and it's so funny how many people still kind of knee-jerk and freak on that. But you know, the guy's gone, the boogeyman's gone, but there's more of a story behind that than people know. There's a lot more going on in regards of, it seems like since he died, people don't realize the amount of just moving legal sweeping battles and whatnot that's going on. And that's some of the stuff we'll be talking about tonight. And we have a very special guest, gentleman who I actually just discovered by looking up a page called Charlie Is Love. And it's got a lot of interesting stuff. Sometimes it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. And, it's not sort of I don't feel it as sort of like a nutter type, crazy person thing. This thing it's handled very well, and it's very thought out, and sometimes it's extremely funny, and its tongue is very firmly in its cheek on a lot of that stuff. But it does take itself serious enough to make sure to try to get the facts right. And the gentleman that actually runs that page is Mr. Charlie McBride, and we have Charlie with us right now. Hey, Charlie, how are you, bud?
Hi, Stevie. How are you? Hi to your audience out there.
Hey, man, I appreciate you being on. And like I said, it took a couple stalls and whatever, but here we are.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. And so anyway, yeah, everyone has their own kind of origin story as why they're doing what they're doing, why they have the interest in it. I know growing up in that time, that all happened in 1969, the year I was born, and the following few years and all that going on after that. So that was I was crawling around in a crib, so I kind of caught it after the fact when they had like the Helter Skelter television movie or whatever it was, and it was just a really weird kind of freaky deal, and kind of everybody's like it killed the 60s, and I'm like, I think the hippies killed the 60s. I think that was like, okay, this is through. But I think everybody thought Charlie was a hippie, but he wasn't really a hippie at all, was he? I mean, do you want to put
No, he certainly wasn't. He didn't consider himself a hippie at all. In fact, he was about 10 or 15 years older than most of the people within the hippie generation. He got out of prison in 1967, and he was already in his 30s when the hippie movement was in full bloom on Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. He considered himself more of, say, the Frank Sinatra generation than, say, the Janis Joplin generation.
Right. Well, definitely. Well, because I heard some people say, well, they would talk about hippies, and he kind of jokes, well, I think, no, we're skippies or something like that. Or
Slippies.
Whatever. Or slippies, like we slip past. Sorry, thank you for correcting me on that.
Yeah.
But people say, well, maybe he's more like a beat. And I said, no, man, nothing like that. Like you said, Frank Sinatra in that earlier era, because he was a Kentucky native and spent a lot of his formative time in reform schools and different boys' homes, and kind of learned the craft of being a proper convict, through all that stuff. And like you said, I mean, he spent so much of his formative years, and I mean, he was what on the street, like maybe a total of 10, 15 years maybe?
Of his entire life? And he
Yeah.
died in his mid-ish 80s. Yeah, I think I used to know the number, but if off the top of my head, it was something like 16 to maybe 19 years of his life was not spent in prison. And this is including his childhood.
Right. And that was what's so crazy is there's so many, again, we talked off air a little bit that okay, there's like the 18-year-old you, there's the 25-year-old you, there's the 35 or 40s, and then if you are lucky enough or unfortunate enough, depending on how you look at it, to get into the golden years and silver years and all that, it's kind of a different game. But he, like you said, he formed out of like a really an abusive background, and I mean, do you want to touch a little bit on that? That way the
Sure.
audience can learn a little bit about it.
Sure. For the people in your audience who don't know, Charles Manson had, as you can expect, a terrible upbringing. He was raised by his mother only partially. He was passed around to various relatives. He had a strange relationship with his mother. She spent several years in jail for armed robbery, and he, of course, became a juvenile delinquent at a very early age. And he had a lot of misfortune in the fact that he wasn't a very good criminal, and he would make a lot of really boneheaded mistakes. And he ended up spending a great number of years in juvenile prisons. In fact, he went to the most infamous one of them all, the famous Boys Town. And there was a newspaper article of a very young Charles Manson saying that he was going to be going to this Boys Town, and he actually escaped from this juvenile facility within, say, a week or two of being there.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and that again shows you like he, even at an early age, he was sort of in a position where he kind of knew take charge, or kind of more or less be the hunter or be hunted. And it seems like he
Yes.
learned the games very quickly and was very adept at it.
Yes. Well, Charles Manson was a very small individual. He was about 5'3" when he was fully grown. So imagine living in prisons, both juvenile facilities and actual real prisons, being 5'3" and trying to survive and actually thrive. And to do that, you have to become quick with your wits, to learn how to manipulate others and how to play the game. And he learned how to play the game masterfully, and he survived in prison. And I've marveled at one aspect of him, is that when he died in his 80s, he was living in a level 4 prison. And if you know what that means, it means that's where the very, very most violent people are.
Yep.
And he was an elderly man, and somehow he survived all those years without getting killed in prison, which is incredible because he lived over 60 years incarcerated.
Well, it's so funny that, funny and like, isn't it peculiar, that he kind of became, in a lot of ways, an elder statesman. I mean, he had a lot of, I guess, respect and probably a certain amount of fear from the other inmates, because, I mean, like we had spoke before, the fact of his just pop culture relevance among anybody from back in the day, like Guns N' Roses and everybody like that. And then, of course, we had talked a little bit about like Gigi Allen and the thing about Gigi Allen, and I really would love to get Merle on one of these days and just really rap with him, because, like I said, there's a stage persona and then there's the heart of the guy, and I think he ended up becoming kind of a caricature of himself, and it betrayed him and caught him up.
Are you talking about Gigi right now, or are you talking about Manson?
Man, you can kind of talk about both of them like it. I think that kind of cult of personality is a monster, and it's real easy to kind of believe your own hype. But I think Charlie, man, that's all he knew. I mean, and I won't get off into Gigi real deep, but Gigi had his own struggles and, poor, Southern kind of thing and all that kind of just hard life, man. But for whatever reason, he turned it toward people and sometimes to himself in sort of a self-abusive way. But not like the thing with Manson, you can go to anybody, especially like, say, they're into like metal or punk or things like that, and because there's not like, well, he was all right. It's like, you're like, oh God, what a monster, thank God he's dead, dance on his grave, whatever. And there's people's like, I don't know, man, I think maybe he was misunderstood, or I think not, like, like what was the old thing when you see the meme and it's got like Michael Myers with his mom and said my son didn't do crap, I don't think it's a thing of that. I mean, there are those people that have really drank the Kool-Aid and just feel that none of them should be in jail. But I think most people's like, like anyone who is connected to a really seemingly pivotal moment in time. Because think about like old Hollywood land and early Hollywood and the way it was and superstar. Man, they were pretty much untouchable. You look into stuff like Bob Crane, which it could be a whole other show. But for the most part, yeah, it was dark. But for the most part, it was like they do their thing. They live in Mount Olympus in these like really killer, gated communities. But one of the others, the thing that was not associated with this somehow jived his way into it, and then all hell broke loose, man. And as I understand,
Yes.
before they were, kind of living out, around, kind of going here and there, and they kind of settled in Spa Ranch, which I think was later in it, because I knew like Charlie was into the Helter Skelter, man. We got to get dirt bikes, we got to get ready for the race war, and all this sort of
Yes.
all this stuff. And he had a lot of these kids, which people say, well, he just fed them LSD every day, and he gave them different, like, breaking down things, almost like a military thing of going, look, you're going to do anything that you've ever had a hang up. You're going to completely reinvent yourself. You're not that person that you knew before is dead. That's why, I think they all got new names, and which probably helped them if they got picked up. They wouldn't go to jail because they didn't have a name, but or couldn't hold them. So, he really had a control that people just, like you said, looking at this little man, it's like, how's that possible?
Well, I have some theories on that. Let's stipulate some things. The Manson family was a cult. There are a lot of people who are fascinated by the Manson family and Charles Manson himself who are in denial about that. They don't believe it was a cult. I absolutely believe it was a cult. And it was sort of, it had a lot of the hallmark characteristics of a cult, which is you had a lot of people in it who were sort of on the down and outs of society or with themselves. These were a lot of members of the so-called Manson family were runaway teenage girls, essentially people who had problems at home, and they left and they joined him. And what they thought they were doing, which is common in a lot of cults, is establishing a new way of life. Some of them, they think it's a new religious order, things like that. But in terms of the Manson group, they thought it was a communal lifestyle. And I would argue that a lot of communes are actually cults. But so you have this lifestyle. One figure emerges from it. In this particular one, it was Charles Manson himself. And he's ascribed supernatural powers. You can look at some of the documentaries where they're interviewing Manson family members back in the 1970s, and they will say things like, he brought a bird back to life in front of us. That's what they're saying at the time, and he could do that.
Right. Apocalyptic type Jesus, like mirroring the acts of Jesus and other deities and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Then what happens with all cults is that paranoia takes over. That's what happened with Jim Jones. That's what happened with the Source family, things like that. And with the Manson family, they believed that somehow, some way, society was going to come crashing down. I don't mean necessarily helter skelter, but they thought things were going to be happening. Again, and if you look at contemporaneous interviews at the time, they all believe this. If you listen to Sandra Good talking about the city of LA was going to burn down, things like that. And then what happens with cults is they want to flee to somewhere. The Jim Jones cult fled to Guyana. Right. Well, the Manson group wanted to flee to Death Valley. And that's, in fact, where they ended up. So when we say Manson had a unique hold over people, he did. But then again, every single cult leader, which is what he was, has a unique ability to do that. But part of it's because of they have a certain sociopathic personality type that likes to control people. And his ability to do that was probably from being able to run prison games on impressionable teenage girls. And the fact that they were isolated, so it becomes an echo chamber. And I would argue that his age difference and his life experience difference was hugely important. You know, one of the most beautiful Manson girls was named Ruth Ann Morehouse. Charlie Manson took her virginity when she was 14, and he was 34.
Jesus.
So psychologically, he was eons ahead of them. He had been in prison longer than that girl had ever been alive.
Right. Well, and that's the thing too, is that people look at like the I'm blanking on. Remember like the whole Hell Bob thing? Everybody's in tracksuits and wearing was it Adidas or something like that?
No, it's Nikes.
Nikes. Okay, my bad. Sorry, Adidas.
And they castrated themselves.
Yeah. Check, please. I'm not cutting anything off, man.
Yeah, I know.
But the thing is, we say that, but let's say we've been fed by these people for years. We've repeated the same mantras and all this and that, and we get into that, like you said, a communal thing to where you're cut off from your family, you're cut off from what you know, you got a different name, you got a different set of rules. You know, look at people who go into prison. They generally don't all hang themselves or kill themselves or whatever. They acclimate and they become institutionalized. You become insta-cult.
Yeah. Yes.
This isn't a word, insta-cultinalized. Or if it is, you know,
I know what you're trying to communicate, and you're exactly right.
And like you said, there's that thing of it doesn't go from day one of going, hey, we're going to go stabby on like the LaBianca family or kill the Folger heiress. It was a kind of a slow build, and he also went through looking at these kids, checking them like fruit. Well, you can tell he's damaged. You can tell this one's got this issue. Maybe this one has a certain addiction or whatever. Sure. I can foster that. I can use that, and I can mold them to this. I will show them love, but I'll also be stern to where they go, well, don't make me be this guy. I mean, I've seen it a lot in working in the prison systems. You have that, well, why did you make me do it? Very, very kind of an abusive thing. And he was masterfully groomed for that.
Yes. I'd also argue, though, that the only type of person who would have joined this group was already broken. That's why they were there in the first place. Perhaps the most second famous person of the Manson group is Lynette Fromme, otherwise known as Squeaky. Well, her and Manson's first encounter is legendary among the people who are fascinated by this, because basically she had been kicked out of her house. She had nowhere to go.
Right.
So she was desperate, and so she viewed Manson as her savior. But if she had had a functional relationship with her family and with life, she wouldn't have needed him in the first place and wouldn't have been vulnerable to any sorts of indoctrination. And by the way, I don't think he really necessarily himself thought, I'm Jesus Christ, or I'm going to become a cult leader. My take on his psychology, and I'm kind of guessing here though, but based on seeing all the interviews with him, I believe he just was a guy who was scrawny. He had been a loser his whole life. I say that gently, but he had been a loser, right? Uneducated, unloved, in prison. And he comes out into this world, and he has beautiful young girls who have fallen in love with him. And he may not have been psychologically equipped to handle that power over those other people, or to handle that ego boost himself. I don't think he was ready for it. And he bought right into it. And who's to necessarily blame him for that? Because what a wild ride that must have been, getting out of prison, coming out, and in a couple years have a dozen or 2 dozen girls who think you're a god, literally a god.
Well, and like you said, it's one of these things. It's I don't know your economic background, but there's something that, like, I grew up kind of as a poor kid, and I saw a lot of my friends, like you said, they would have like super nice wheels and super nice car, but they're living in like squalor, and it's that mentality. They didn't know how to handle the sudden influx of wealth, just like he could not absorb. He's always been under the thumb, and now he's in that position. I'm not saying, well, of course he had to go crazy and do all this, but I think all the stuff that tied into whatever, plus the fact that, I'm sure that they were imbibing in a lot of different, chemicals.
Sure.
Any of that, are you familiar with the term assassins and how originally it came from the word Hassan and hashish, where they would use a lot of drug. Yeah, they would use these mercs, and they would feed them, just constant hashish and other hallucinogens and stuff. And it just totally dulled them down to where they would kind of go, hey man, go over there and slit that guy's throat, go over there and whatever, burn
Well,
that
I have
village.
one point I want to argue with you here slightly.
Lay it on me.
Is that what?
Oh, I said lay it on me. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I don't believe that the helter-skelter motive is accurate. And for your listeners out there, what I'm saying is this, just so we understand each other. I believe in the Manson trials, they got the right people. They got them for the right crimes, absolutely. But I don't think they had the motive down. But you don't have to nail the motive in order to nail a conviction. In other words, I believe Charles Manson absolutely should have gone to jail. However, the famous helter-skelter theory of motive, I don't believe, because I think it's too ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a scapegoat situation. And again, guilty. But I think it was a thing of going, right time, Vietnam War stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We got these kids that they're saying are dodging drafts. They're a threat. Okay, we've got to get this under control. Okay, boom, we're going to make an example of these guys. And the fact is, you start lopping off heads of people who are influential and whatnot, then it's like, oh, well, they're hitting our golden idols. We really got to bring the hammer down. And I don't think Charlie would. And again, I've lost family, not to murders, but I've lost family, and I know if somebody in my family was murdered, I might very well be the same thing. But you can't let grief, no matter how fervent and real it is to the person, cloud the judgment and justice of the judicial system. And I think to a point that happened.
Kind of.
Right.
But Manson, just so your audience is clear, I've been actually kicked off a Manson site or two on Facebook for saying these kinds of things. I felt Charles Manson botched his defense, but he probably would have been convicted anyway. He went with an obstructionist technique, and I don't know what your audience knows or doesn't know, but basically he tried to represent himself, which would have been asinine. So they gave him a series of lawyers, including one, Ira Reiner, who later became the district attorney for Los Angeles. But Manson wanted to control things, so he went with a lawyer named Irving Kanarek, who was known for being incredibly obstructionist, meaning he compulsively would object to things in order to stretch the trial out, but he was an ineffective lawyer overall. And I felt if Manson had taken his defense a little more seriously, he would have had a better chance of winning, although I think any competent district attorney would have been able to put him away, particularly for the second night, the LaBianca night of the Tate LaBianca trials.
All right, let me ask you one thing real quick.
Yeah.
I only interject because I'll forget what I'm going to ask you. You were talking about all the obstructions. Was it the lawyer, or was it Charlie who?
It was his style. It was
Okay,
the lawyer style. He was known for he would object if you. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. What I was saying was it he or Charlie who had the whole thing where the girls would come in and would be screaming, you're on trial and whatever, and then
Manson did that.
That was all Charlie. Okay, I was curious because
Yes, which of course fed right into the prosecutor's story, because the prosecutor's story. Let me backtrack one moment.
Sure.
For your audience listening, Charles Manson wasn't actually at the murder site of the Sharon Tate murders. He wasn't there. And he wasn't in the house the second night when the LaBianca family, the couple, were killed. Okay? So what they have to do, particularly the prosecutor, particularly on the first night, their legal argument is something akin to this. If a mob boss tells a hitman, go kill somebody, the hitman kills somebody, both the mob boss and the hitman are guilty of murder legally. So on the night when Sharon Tate and a few others were killed, Manson wasn't even there. He was 20, 30 miles away. So the prosecution's argument was Manson had complete domination and control over the people in the so-called Manson family, okay? And he got them to do this. Well, what the jurors are seeing in the trial itself is the girls clearly ordered by Manson, and they've in their adult years admitted to this, he would stage little rebellions by them in the courtroom where the girls would stand up and throw Nazi salutes simultaneously at the judge, or chant the judge is just a woman, or or Nixon says Manson is guilty, things like that to disrupt it. But they're clearly doing that at his demand or request, which demonstrated to them Manson had control over them, which was part of the reason, I assume, on some at least subconscious level, why they gave him a guilty verdict for conspiracy of murder for the Tate night.
Yeah. Well,
Did that sound clear to you? What I'm trying to communicate?
no, yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying. I mean, the thing too is, I'm surprised, like you said, when they would come in there, which it almost sounds like they were pushing for change of venue to go, oh well, Nixon has already said he's guilty, and they show a paper. Then how you can go, oh, strike that, but that's already in the minds of the jurors. How did they not push, and why did they not push to get change of venue out of that particular jurisdiction?
Okay, you bring up a good point, because there are some things. Manson had a very big beef about a few issues, and I'm going to talk about them. First, for your audience listening, Richard Nixon during the trial said Charles Manson is guilty, but he said it during the trial. So the LA Times had a headline that says Manson guilty, Nixon declares. And one of the Manson lawyers, I believe it was Day Shin, snuck him a copy of the newspaper, and Manson flashed this to the jury in an attempt to basically create a mistrial, you see.
Right.
And they did try to do that, and Manson at one point also tried to attack a judge. And my understanding is
with a
that
pencil,
the judge's what? Excuse me?
It was with a pencil.
With a pencil.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the judge's logic, I believe it is my understanding, he said he didn't want Manson to benefit from his bad acts.
Right. Not
and
show fear and think he can do that.
Yeah, exactly. But there is one point that Manson had a very good argument about one thing. The trial lasted for months and months and months. However, when it came time for the defense to put on a trial, they rested without calling a single witness. In other words, he didn't put on a defense. And he was furious about this, and he resented it till the day he died. And what I've never understood and never gotten a clear answer on is, if Manson said, listen to me, my lawyer rested and didn't put on a defense, that's absolutely not what I wanted to do. Why couldn't he get a retrial? And I don't know if that avenue was pursued or not. He might not have been able to get a lawyer willing to take that on.
Right.
But I've always wondered that too. If he wanted to put on a defense and was overruled by his lawyer, why couldn't he have gotten a retrial based on that, especially in the context of this? One of the defendants, Leslie Van Houten, her lawyer died during closing arguments, or just prior to closing arguments. So she had a substitute lawyer give her closing argument. Well, she got a retrial based just on that by this judge. So I'm wondering, why didn't he actually get a retrial based on the fact that he wanted to put on a defense, which would have been unsuccessful in my opinion, but it's just something I've always wondered about.